Chapter 9, Section 3, Organized Labor. Alrighty, so let's talk about labor and labor unions. So first things first, you gotta understand employer and employees. Employer is more of the manager, and then that manager hires workers or their employees. Okay, one thing to note is that wages are determined by forces of supply and demand, like how much money a company is making. If the supply and demand are balanced well, then the company is making money, and that's how they determine their wages. Another thing to write down in your notes is that workers who command the highest wages are those with specialized skills and who are in a short supply. So basically how fast a worker can do something in a short period of time with a good quality. Questions to think about is do employees get paid too little, too many hours? Are their working conditions all okay? Some of their options that they turn to is that they form labor unions, and their main goal is to gain their control over the wages, change the wages, increase them, because they want to make more money. This leads into the labor movement. So labor unions arose largely in response to changes in working conditions brought by the Industrial Revolution. So more mechanized machinery became in part into the Industrial Revolution, and so that they had to have factory workers, which concludes the factory work in the 1900s, late 1800s to 1900s. They had men, women, and children working on operating machines, which lead to dangerous injuries. And injured workers lost their jobs because they had to get laid off because they can't work. A quote from a manager of a textile mill in Fall River, Massachusetts says, "I regard people just as I regard my machinery. So as long as they can do my work for what I choose to pay them, I keep them getting out of them all I can." So manager doesn't really care about the people, he just wants to make his money. Unions take their hold. So this is when they start to form and people know more about them. So the skilled workers begin to form unions because they're not making enough money, they want to make more money. This is more the factory workers who are, let's say, making a car. Usually it leads to strikes, and those strikes lead to unions. Employers fired and replaced workers who try to organize. So basically they say, hey, you're organizing, we don't want you here, so I'm going to fire you and replace you with other workers. And those workers who get fired off strike to create unions. This is a problem because the courts at that time treated those unions as illegal, which gave the company more paperwork to do. A guy to write down is Samuel Gompers. He basically created labor movements, and he was a cigar maker, so he was a wealthy man. It's interesting because he created those labor movements for people who wanted their wages to increase. And again, his goals, just like any labor movement, was to increase the wages. They want shorter hours and safer work. And he created the American Federation of Labor. Get that down in your notes. Employers started to resist the attempts to unionize, so the employers say, no, we don't want you to unionize, so we're going to fire you. We don't want you on our property. And so when they laid off those workers or fired them, when they replaced, okay, I want to cut that for a second. Okay, so workers, the employers say, hey, we don't want you, so we're going to fire you, and we're going to replace you with a new guy. And when they replace that new guy, they make them sign a contract, which are called yellow dog contracts. Yellow dog meaning coward, referring to them being a coward, and basically promises them not to join unions, which gets the company out of problems for court. Companies can call court orders called injunctions to force striking employees back to work, and all that works in a cycle. Companies call court orders called injunctions to force striking employees back to work. So because that didn't work so well, companies go as far as to hire militias to harass union organizers or even fight them, resulting in injury or death. Congressional protections, the expansion of workers' rights. Basically, Congress was like, you know what, I kind of like what you guys are doing, so we're gonna give you this right, and that basically gave the union workers more confidence, more strength, and so more and more people were coming in, and that made the nation's non-farm workforce go up by 35% around that time in the 1940s. All this was after the Great Depression, so between 1930s and 1940s, unions became more dominant force in many industries.
Please excuse the interruption. Two announcements. First of all, Mr. Portner's afternoon classes will proceed as normal. You'll be able to go out to the shop and have class, starting with 6th period. Also, freshmen, we are having our class meeting shortly, so please proceed to the auditorium. Sit in the back right corner. Once again, Mr. Portner is able to hold classes this afternoon, so please go there for class 6th, 7th, and 8th periods today. And freshmen at this time, please come to the auditorium, stay in the back right corner. Thank you.
Okay, so unions basically kind of made their own companies, you can say, so they worked in their own industries and basically kicked out there weren't as many employers, it was all groups of people, and they controlled any operations from shipbuilding, garbage collection to steel production. And an interesting thing to know about unions is that they collected billions of dollars to cover costs of activities for organizing, making political decisions, or providing aid to striking workers. So all that money they made from steel production, garbage collection, and shipbuilding, they made billions of dollars. More towards the late 90s, there was a decline in the labor movement. Unions became to abuse their power because they were so overconfident. They were like, okay, so we're gonna, unions became to abuse their power. They wanted to preserve outdated and inefficient production methods in order to protect jobs. This is known as feather bedding. Unions managed to preserve jobs positions that were unnecessary. The result was that companies badly needed to improve efficiency to stay competitive, and found that unions could be an obstacle. The reputation of unions suffered because of this, and because of links to organized crime. Like, let's say a drug dealer takes over a union and they make those people do illegal operations. Right to work laws. Effort to curb union power, the Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, allowed states to pass right to work laws, which was a measure that banned mandatory union membership. The right to work laws can be a factor for a decline in union membership in recent decades. And in 2005, the union membership dropped at less than 8% of the labor force. That's good. By today's union, membership is limited by the United States and many other countries, so there's not a lot of unions nowadays. Lots of traditional strongholds. There is a theory that structural changes in the U.S. economy have caused union membership to decline. An example of that is that unions have traditionally been the strongest among their blue-collar workers, and so these workers perform manual labor, manufacturing jobs, and early wages. Unions are usually the weakest in the white-collar employees. White-collar employees are your people earning weekly salaries, and your blue-collar workers are the people earning your hourly salaries. And also the government workers are unionizing too. They're making strikes. They don't like how their government is functioning, so they're striking, forming unions with a lot of problems. So one thing to note is private sector versus public sector. Private sector is more private companies like the government, and the public sector is more like public schools and teaching. In the book, it says that teachers argue that unions are needed to promote the interests of their workers. This is a second example. So certain manufacturing industries have traditionally employed a large number of union workers. Because of this, they are hurt by their foreign competition. As a result, many industries have laid off or fired workers, which has cut into union strength. Third and fourth example, third one is that rising proportion of women in the labor force has also affected the union membership, since women have been less likely to join in unions. So around this time, women weren't working as much, and so there's a rising proportion of women in the labor force. Number 4 is that seeking to reduce their production costs, some industries have relocated from the Northeast, Middle East around the South, which is historically less friendly to unions. We know about that. You should know about that. Lessened need for unions. Now, there's a second theory that unions decline, is that other institutions now provide many of the services that have been won in the past throughout union activity. An example is that government has passed law setting workplace safety standards on a shorter work week, provides unemployment insurance and social security. I talked about that way back then. Can't remember, it was chapter 3, I think. More non-organized workers, more ununionized employers offer benefits such as medical insurance. I talked about that too. Labor and management. Okay, so the union gains the right to represent their workers at a company when a majority of workers in a particular unit or factory vote to accept the union. Okay, then the company is required by law to bargain with them and in good faith to negotiate an employee contract. So the union increases their efficiency and product, they make a lot of money. Is the first step, that's what they do. They have a meeting and then the second part is that they list their demands. So one side says, oh, I want this, and then their side says, okay, I want this, and then they argue about it. And the third step is that there's conflict. An example in the book, they say that the union might believe that workers' pay is too low, so the management decides it will compromise on job security and working conditions, but will not yield on pay, and that's because profits are down. And after all that, after the meeting, they list their demands and the conflict, they either agree or they disagree. If there's no deal, then they will go on strike or have a deadlock, which basically means neither side agrees and nothing's gonna happen on workers. Another thing to note, jot down in your notes, is that labor and management generally don't benefit from a prolonged work stoppage. Both sides often come back for the collective bargaining process, each of a new contract. So if after the deadlock, so there's no more conflict, there's no nothing, both sides are kind of neutral in a sense, and then after a while they come back and they discuss a different deal, or let's say how this could work. Basically they strategize to make a new contract, and again it's like a cycle. They can go here and then they can go through that whole process again, and then they might have to make another contract or something along those lines. Let's talk about collective bargaining. Okay, so an example is in your book on page 240. Okay, so it says, picture a room on each side of the table. Wait, can I draw this up here? Okay, here's a picture example for what we just talked about. So basically there's two sides. There's side A and there's side B, or company A, company B, however you want to do it. And then there's the crowd or the spectators over here, and they're listening to both sides. And all of this is a union, but they have conflicting views. And so, let's say if the first union is like, okay, I want wages and benefits, okay? And then the other one says, no, I want to talk about working conditions. And so they strategize. Let's say, okay, so if let's say side B says, okay, so I want the working conditions to be cleaner. I don't want it to be as dirty, and I want it to be there to be less injuries. And so because of that, side A agrees and says, well, I think because of that, we can increase our wages. And with that, since we're making they're increasing their wages basically because the company's making a lot of money. And so since the company's making a lot of money, they can buy those supplies to make the working conditions safer. And then if there's a conflict, let's say, for example, this one talks about side A talks about job security. And let's say side B talks about wages and benefits. Okay, so job security basically is your job going to be secure? Are you going to get fired, or are you going to have, is this a white collar job that you're going to have for the rest of your life? And so what side A argues is that, well,